Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to Circle of Fellows. This is the second episode of a new series that features IABC Fellows getting together once a month for a chat, a deep dive into one particular topic. And this month, the topic is ROI and measurement of communication. And we have a great panel of fellows with us today, so we'll go around and introduce them. I am Shel Holtz, by the way, from Holtz Communication Plus Technology and the FIR Podcast Network, but I want to focus on the panelists today. So why don't we start with you, Angela?
I'm Angela Sinickas. I am also a fellow, obviously. That's why we're here. I've been a member of IABC since 1979, and I got interested in measurement about 1 year later because I had a new president at the company who was an accountant, and I had to figure out how to measure in order to connect with him. So once I did that, I never turned back. I started doing communication measurement full-time 15 years ago and love every minute.
Great. And Jim?
Jim Shaffer. I lead the Jim Shaffer Group, which is a team of people who specialize in helping companies execute their strategy in a more accelerated way. We focus on leadership and creating high-performance organizations. I was with Towers Perrin for 20 years as a principal and one of the architects of the change management practice at Towers.
Great. Letty?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Leticia Narvaez. I've been a member of IABC since I started my communication career 30 years ago. And I'm accredited. I'm a fellow since a few years ago. I'm based in Mexico City, and I have my own consulting firm on strategic communications, media training, crisis management, and I give a lot of training on all communication-related subjects.
And last but definitely not least, Jennifer.
Hey guys, Jennifer Waugh here in North Vancouver, Canada, where it's a little smoky from summer fires today. Very pleased to be here. My company is Forwards Communication, and we do internal communications and strategic storytelling for organizations. I'm a longtime IABCer, a longtime volunteer, and pretty passionate about the IABC way, which through its awards programs and accreditation and new certification program, et cetera, really puts priority on measurement. So happy to be here for this discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for taking the hour out of your days to do this. As I mentioned, the topic is measurement and ROI, and I want to get ROI on the table right away because I have an issue with ROI. ROI is an accounting term, and it means something very, very specific. It is what you made dollar-wise minus what it cost divided by what it cost, with the result of that equation expressed as a percentage. And I keep running into communicators, both in person as well as I judge a lot of communication competition entries for various organizations, and they always talk about ROI when I think what they really mean is results. They'll say the ROI of this effort was increased awareness, for example. And it's my belief that if we walk into the C-suite and talk about ROI that way, they may nod very politely, but when we leave, they're going to laugh and say, hey, that's a communicator who doesn't know what ROI is. Is that something you agree with, or is there a more generic way that we can talk about ROI?
No, not generic. I agree. We absolutely have to keep it specific the way the financial people use it. I've heard return on conversation, return on engagement. They're all garbage. It has to be return on investment, and the only way you can really show it for communication is when you can connect communication to a specific behavior change, because behavior changes actually have a financial value. Awareness, information, understanding, sentiment do not.
This is Jim. I totally agree with Angela. I think it not only is about behavior change, but the right behavior change that demonstrates that there was value added. That is, your gain is greater than the cost of creating that gain. I see so many times that all other functions and all other departments are required to add value. But if a communication project or activity doesn't create a gain that's bigger than the cost of getting there, you likely drained value from the organization. Customers don't like that, and shareholders don't like that.
Yes, and I would like to add about that that this behavior change has to be mentioned since the beginning, since we set our communication objectives, in order for us to be able to really measure how was this before and how was after, how was the impact of the change behavior after we made all our communication efforts.
One of the challenges in ROI that I've run into is people who insist that the kind of communication they're doing or the goals that they set, you can't find out what the dollar value is. And I usually push back on that. I usually challenge that. For example, if the goal is to reduce turnover and through whatever measures you're using, you determine that the communication effort resulted in a 2% reduction in turnover, you can find out what it costs to replace an employee. In fact, in the U.S., the average is 2.5 times 1 year's salary the last time I checked. And as a result, you can go back and say, this is what we spent on this effort. We reduced turnover by 2%, and therefore the ROI is X. Isn't it possible to assess the dollar impact of pretty much anything in the organization?
I would agree. I would agree, Shel. I think that if people are doing things that aren't able to be measured, they're probably doing the wrong things, or they don't know how to measure. I would totally agree with you, particularly turnover. Usually we establish a baseline the day before we go into an organization because our being there creates the Hawthorne effect. Start doing things differently. To establish a baseline of what the turnover is, and in the case of a ConAgra Foods operation, we reduced it by 24%, and did exactly what you said. We measured the cost of turnover, replacement, retraining, et cetera, and we had a very, very clear number, and we just simply had that number, we had our costs, and it was easy to determine that with a 24% return and a major cost avoidance.
One of the things we have to be very careful about is being as specific as possible about what the desired outcome of a communication project is. Because something like turnover, I still think is a little bit broad because there are so many things that can affect that. So we need to find a way to hone in on some aspect of the environment that communication can improve. But then the other secret is we have to be able to isolate the impact of communication. As Jim mentioned, time is one of those factors. Another way, though, is a pilot study where you can control better for all those other variables. Like, for example, if the market drops or the economy heats up, that could affect things like turnover. But if you have pilot and control groups, those types of factors will affect both sets of groups. And if you see a better improvement in the place where you did the communication, then you can say clearly the communication was the only variable that was different. And that makes it a tighter argument for most executives.
And Angela, I know I've heard you say before that that old Sherlock Holmes line that in the absence of any other reason, your communication effort being the only factor that you can point to, it must be the reason, right?
Well, assuming there's a really clear line of sight change. Like one example I've used is a friend of mine who got more people to start using the special access code before making long-distance phone calls. And the company had been trying to do things for years and nobody actually did it. The very month where she started doing this campaign, suddenly people started using the access code. And at that point, nobody else was doing anything about using the access code. So it has to be not just in absence of anything else. You have to have a clear, direct communication campaign to focus on something while nobody else was doing something that focused.
Right.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's an analytical issue, and it's a coincidence and common sense issue. We were working with FedEx on the West Coast, the Los Angeles operation, to improve exports out there. And 2 weeks into the activity, we'd already established our baseline. We were working with a team of employees. And I walked into the room, and my client, Terry Simpson, head of internal communication, said, Jim, I've got some information. 2 weeks into the project, she says, we had a 26% spike in export. And she said, could that be possible? I said, it's not possible. We need to find out why it's there. She went and checked, and back, and she said, that's because all the Academy Award nominations went out last week, and the percentage went up. So we kind of discounted that. But over a period of 4 months, nothing else occurred like that, and we were able to increase exports by 23% and had a 1,447% return. So, yeah, you do have to use common sense in some of this, too.
Let me bring up not a different perspective, but an added perspective, I guess. Many people in communications sort of might identify themselves with the words tribe or the numbers tribe. And Shel, you started us off by speaking fairly scientifically about the art and science of communications. And I guess one thing I hear in doing storytelling for organizations and a lot of internal communications is the challenge that many communicators have, again, especially internally, with linking those, connecting the dots in that way. And I mean, I've certainly had some successes along the lines of what you're talking about, where we've set an engagement goal and can directly relate aspects of that to a communication effort. For example, a corporate history book that focused on a number of tragedies that had happened in the company, and therefore had a very strong safety message. When we surveyed people afterwards about the degree to which the book's messages had improved their safety, had improved what they were doing with regards to safety on the job, you know, we had a very direct increase in that. But Shel, one time years ago, you used a set of 3 terms that really resonated with me, and I use it a lot, which I think we do from each other, all of us in IABC. And you talked about, it was at a Gold Quill Blue Ribbon panel, and you talked about the more nebulous areas of outputs, outcomes, and outtakes. So, right. And I'll let you expand on that, but I guess that's the kind of thing I see more in the internal comms world.
Yeah, and well, actually, outputs, outtakes, and outcomes, the first time I read about them, it was applied to external communication, but I think it fits anywhere. And to give credit where it's due, Katie Payne is the one who introduced me to this in her book, Measuring Public Relationships. She also wrote a book called Measure What Matters, and I think they're both excellent resources. But the output is where communicators, I think, traditionally tended to stop. The output is how many press releases did we distribute? How many videos did we upload? How many tweets did we send? The outtakes is pretty much what the audience takes away from it. So if there's improved understanding, for example, that would be an outtake. But the outcome is the behavior change that Angela, you were talking about a little bit ago. Now, all of these are valid metrics, and there's a nice matrix that the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication has put together, that along the top is the sales funnel, right, starting with awareness and then consideration and preference and the like. Along the left-hand side is essentially outputs, outtakes, and outcomes. And you fill in what measures you want for each of those, but at the lower right-hand corner, finally, is that ROI. You know, I remember when I first got into media relations in the mid-1980s, we were measuring column inches of coverage based on the press releases we sent out, and we stopped there. You know, because we didn't know any better. That what we were looking for is, what did we get out of the people who actually read the article, not how many inches of coverage did we get in all the papers that reported on it.
But Shel, I completely agree with you. I think what I'm hearing an awful lot of impatience with business leaders, with communication people who, let me give you an example. Recently with a large pharmaceutical, I was talking to the head of commercial operations, that's marketing in a pharma business, and he was saying, I am so frustrated with my internal communication, or my external and internal, because they approach business problems backwards. I tell them what the problem is, and they start saying, well, I've got this activity, I can do a tweet on this, and I can do a poster on that, and blah, blah, blah. He says, why don't they ever do root cause analysis, identify where the communication breakdowns are causing the performance to decline, and then start addressing it from the output or outcome-oriented process? And I'm hearing that from a lot of business leaders today. All they care about is getting their activity out. They measure activity. They don't try to help me really improve my business.
It's interesting, Jim, because I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing a lot more of the communicators focusing very clearly on business outcomes and identifying before they even, usually I hear the executive saying, I need a brochure, I need a speech, I need a web posting. I'm seeing the communicators saying more, great, I'd love to help you with that, but help me understand what makes you think we need some communication? What problem have you been observing that creates this problem? And then they do the research to identify what knowledge is lacking, what attitudes are wrong, and then which channels would be the best suited to those knowledge and attitude messages. So I'm actually seeing a big trend moving towards the direction we should be going. What you're describing, I heard executives saying a lot more like 15 years ago, 10 years ago than I do now.
I'm hearing that too, Angela. I'm hearing more people in the communication business asking the right questions. I think we got two trends going on that may meet up here in a very, very nice fashion.
Which makes me very curious, Letty, outside of the U.S., what are you hearing? What are executives and communicators looking for in terms of results?
Well, definitely, they every time they are asking for more and more measurement, that they want to see more results compared to what the objectives were at the beginning. And I like to what Jim was mentioning. I would like to mention an example that we worked on a pharmaceutical company a few years ago, and we were creating an awareness campaign on diabetes and obesity because, as you know, in Mexico, obesity is one of the most important disease problems now, especially among children. And so we work with marketing in order to develop a specific PR campaign and awareness campaign on this. And what we did is something like what Angela mentioned. We made like a pilot group. So we developed, marketing was already making their efforts in 3 different states in Mexico. So we focused on one specific state in Mexico where we developed marketing and PR efforts. And in the other states, they were only marketing efforts. So we could measure exactly what the contribution had been in elevating and increasing the awareness about diabetes and obesity in that specific state where we developed the PR efforts compared to the other states. So I think, and this is something that the executives and the CEOs are demanding more and more. They want to really see the results of the communication efforts compared to what we had said at the beginning of the strategic plans.
I saw a case study of a communication effort. It was very interesting. It was out of a public housing organization in the UK. And what they did was identify where security had gotten lax among employees, and they did a campaign to raise awareness of, I think, 16 or 17 different issues. And one of them, for example, was people were swiping their card key and coming into the building but not checking behind them to make sure that an unauthorized person wasn't following them in. For about 6 of these issues, they did Vine videos, these 6-second videos. What they did was they bought a cloak and a scythe and a skull mask to represent evil, right? And for the issue of swiping the card key, the guy walked in and the guy in the cloak and the mask followed him. They did some research afterwards, and what they found was that the issues that had these Vine videos associated with them had far greater recall than the issues that were merely communicated with text. There's no ROI in that metric, but it's a valid measure, isn't it?
Oh, there could be an ROI, though, because you could easily find out if some of these security problems have led to security breaches that led to some kind of financial loss. So
yeah,
you
sure.
could create an ROI.
I agree with that 100%, but in terms of determining that the ones with videos did better than the ones without, I see that as an outtake and not an outcome, right? That tells you that down the road maybe you need to do more of these videos in order to improve the recall of your communication. What I'm suggesting is that outputs and outtakes are not invalid metrics, but you need to continue down that path and get to the outcomes, because that's what your leadership should care about.
Yeah, I agree with you, Shel. I think there are leading indicators and trailing indicators, and what you just identified, I think, is that there are ways that we know that if we use more of that Vine kind of a video, we are apt to get a better result from a security standpoint. And to Angela's point, if we can measure the loss that was occurring before that and after that, maybe we have an ROI. Right,
exactly. So I want to talk briefly about, in your experience, what are the most egregious things that we're measuring incorrectly in this profession? What metrics are we applying that we shouldn't. I remember seeing a video once in which I think it was Cami Heisa said, we spend a lot of time measuring the wrong things. What do you see people measuring wrong?
Well, I'll jump in. I am still shocked, and we were talking about this briefly before we started up, Shel. I'm still shocked when I do judging of various awards programs to see people using the AVE, or advertising value equivalent measurement. It just boggles the mind. It's been discounted in so many ways, and yet communicators are still very much, well, not very much using it, but I still see it quite regularly.
And especially the big PR agencies, Jennifer.
Yes.
That's where it's really unbelievable.
And the answer I get when I ask about it is that's what the leaders or the client is asking for. And isn't it incumbent upon us to educate them that why it's not a valid metric?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I've always seen it as measuring something we didn't set out to accomplish in the first place.
Well, I think it's interesting because it's wrong for so many reasons. And just so we can maybe define this for people who don't know what AVE is, it's saying if we got a certain amount of news coverage, if we had to buy an ad that took that much space or time, here's what we would have had to pay for it. So that's what it's based on. So number one, it's not real money, because when you get that kind of coverage, you don't reduce your advertising budget, so you're not saving that money. That's not representative of how much extra money your company earned because of getting that news coverage. And it's also not comparable because, well, on the one hand, news coverage might be seen as more credible than an ad, but on the other hand, the ad, you control the message, whereas the news coverage could have had things wrong, could have mentioned your competition, but it's just not real money. It's so much easier to do real money. Just as an example, communicators always complain that they didn't get coverage everywhere. Well, I look at that as a wonderful opportunity. Because if you're in a business-to-consumer kind of industry, you can quickly take a look at, you started some kind of new ad, some new PR blitz, and you got coverage in some places, not in others. What happened to the sales of that product in the markets where you had heavy coverage versus no coverage? And that's going to show you real money.
Which comes down to the sort of action and reaction measurement portion of the measurement, right? Which also can't necessarily be linked to those situations where AVEs are being touted as a measure of success. Sorry.
The other. Excuse me, Letta. Go ahead.
Yes, another thing that sometimes is mistakenly measured is, for example, when we organize a town hall meeting where the CEO and the executive committee is going to communicate changes on the strategies, new projects, results of the company, changes on the mission, different changes on the culture, and how you want your employees to be involved and engaged in that. Sometimes we measure our success because of the number of people who attended the town hall meeting. And sometimes there's a lot of people because their bosses ask them to be there, and that's it. But I think that we should go more about that and go more deep about what if the message really was communicated correctly, if our employees really understood what the message was, what was their reaction, what was the impact in their behavior, did they react in a different way. So, but I still see a lot about just measuring the number of people who attended an event, a town hall, without really going farther than that.
And that's the same thing with web usage statistics. How many people clicked on something? And that doesn't tell you that they found what they were looking for or that they found something useful. It just tells me that the page they were on immediately before was really effective at getting them to click.
Yeah, Shel and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday about click-throughs and that sort of measure, and it goes back to the thing we were talking about a little bit ago. You got no gain out of it. You didn't sell more wine. You didn't sell more cars, but it sure cost you money to create that, or create the thing that Angela was talking about a little bit ago. The fact is, the news release, somebody had to write the news release that didn't generate real money. So isn't that a drain on resources rather than a gain, or even a neutral? And from Lean Six Sigma training, is the customer willing to pay for that? And the answer is no, the customer's not willing to pay for that. But certain people continue to do that.
Yeah, years ago in IABC's Communication World magazine, in fact, there was an article by Ed Robertson, the late, great Ed Robertson, who ran internal communications at FedEx. Interestingly, he reported directly to the CEO because the CEO perceived the value of that communication. But he created what he called, terrible name I thought, the pyramid of communication quality. And what he said was sort of a parallel to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the bottom was attention. He said you have to get people's attention. If they're not going to pay attention to it, everything else is irrelevant. Well, actually, at the bottom was logistics. Right, you had to get it to people at the right time. If you've ever received an employee benefits solicitation in the mail a week after the benefits deadline has lapsed, that's a failure of logistics. Something in the wrong language, something where the design is so awful that you can't read it. But then you have attention. If people aren't going to pay attention to it, they're not going to go further. Then once you've got their attention, it has to be relevant. And Ed suggested 2 layers of relevance. One is, does it have anything to do with me? And 2, if I pay attention to it, is it going to make things better or easier for me? And only once you have satisfied those layers do you get to the top, which is, what do you want from me? I'm ready to be influenced. So, Letty, you talked about town hall meetings. When I worked for Allergan, after every town hall meeting, we would do sort of a pulse poll of about 100 randomly selected employees, where we asked questions about logistics, attention, relevance, and influence. And if we found out that we blew it at the attention level, we would know what to fix next time or what we had to go out and do more communication on. It's not ROI, it's an outtake, but it's still an important metric. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that you don't want to measure these sorts of things. I just want to suggest that that's not where you stop, right?
Oh, no, definitely. I think I also measured that. I did some surveys, questionnaires after the town hall to ask a few of the people there what they thought, if they understood the message and other things. However, we went like more for that, and what we did is we wrote all the questions that had been made. What were the concerns about of the employees about what had been said about the messages, and we tried to emphasize those answers not only in the town hall meeting but afterwards in the different communication channels that we had. And after that, then is when we tried to measure what the impact had been about from the message that it is measuring that.
Anybody else? Other thoughts on Ed's approach?
Well, I think you're right in that they can help you diagnose where your communication may have gone wrong. But a lot of times we're kind of kept to a minimum as to how many questions we can ask. So I kind of don't pay much attention to the awareness or the attention. I really go for, did people understand? And not just do they feel they understand, but do they actually have the right knowledge? If you do a knowledge quiz with right and wrong answers, because I've had situations where in focus groups there's really high awareness of the CEO's vision for how to double the value of the company in the next 5 years. Everyone could quote it. But the problem was when they described what they were supposed to do to help achieve it, I was not hearing the same thing I heard the CEO say. So when we did our survey, we actually had knowledge questions. One of them was, which of the following things are true about how we're going to double the value of the company? And as it turned out, only 30% of employees had the right answer, 70% got it completely wrong, and because of that, they were doing the wrong things. So, it almost doesn't matter, was it the logistics or was it the attention? They're simply doing the wrong things. We've got to throw everything at it to make sure they're getting that information at all those levels.
And Jim, I know one of the things that you do with organizations is a cost to value analysis.
Correct.
When you and I were both doing some work with ConAgra, you produced that, and I think that's an underused technique in measurement.
Well, I think so too, and I think the big help here is that we're all hearing so many people say, "I've got too much on my plate, so much on my plate." The truth is that not everything ranks at 10 in terms of importance. A lot of stuff is low importance, and there's a lot of stuff that's high importance. Yes, the value to cost assessment is a great way to do that, and what that is really two sets of questions. The first question on the survey is the extent to which certain channels or activities or other media are important to helping you do your job well. The second question is then how well is it meeting your expectations. The third dimension is cost, and so you assign a fully loaded cost, meaning all the compensation benefit loads as well as the operating cost to create that activity, and you assess that with a group of people, and you come back with 4 quadrants: high importance, high performance, high important, low performance, low importance, low performance, low important, high performance. But it tells us where we start to map and identify how we start to have a bigger impact on those things that are helping people do their jobs better and reduce the cost at the same time.
Because I think in a lot of organizations there are some communications where we're investing a lot of time and a lot of resources because we've always done it this way, right?
Yeah, and Shel, you and I discovered as we looked at all the low important, low performance things that we didn't stop doing it on agri-food. Yammer was one of them. It scored 22 out of 22 different activities. It was a bad implementation, as you recall. Right. There was no adoption strategy. It was simply put out into the marketplace. So essentially, it doesn't mean that everything in that low 2 boxes is bad. It could be an execution issue, as we discovered.
You know, one of the other measures that I'm seeing, Jennifer, I'm glad you brought up AVEs because I cringe every time I see somebody reference them. But one that's everybody's using these days is impressions online. The number of impressions, in the old days of print media relations, we called it opportunity to see, OTS. An impression would be, if a person looked at the front page of the New York Times, and every story on that front page registered an impression. And I swear every single entry that I got in competitions from Reagan Communications, from the Content Marketing Institute, even from IABC, listed impressions, and I just wanted to tear my eyeballs out. It was making me crazy.
Well, isn't this a little like the click-throughs as well?
Yeah.
Did it really sell? Did it sell more wine? Did it sell more cars? No. You just spent something and you didn't get a return on it. Maybe you didn't get an acceptable return on it.
Well, Shel, you might look at that as the impressions might be that logistics. Did you get the message in front of the right people at the right time? So it might be a precursor to better things happening, but as a be-all and end-all measurement, absolutely not. I mean, if you didn't get in front of anyone, you absolutely failed.
Yeah, and that's what I'm seeing is when you get to the evaluation section of the entry, it says we achieved 137 million impressions on Twitter and 240 million impressions on Facebook, and that's the be-all and end-all of their evaluation. And to me, that leaves me wondering what they actually accomplished.
Yeah. I think that's a lot. There's a couple things you can do with the online. I think if you've got ways that people can actually evaluate what they saw, they can retweet it, they can share it, they can get an RSS feed. That's at least giving you some indication that what they read, number one, that they did read it. They didn't just click onto that page, but they clicked a button on that page itself that says, I found content that was useful. It was actually so useful I want to share it with other people, or I want to keep getting it. That becomes a much more useful click to count.
Yeah. Everybody here is a consultant. In fact, everybody here is an independent consultant. So I'd like to go around and ask, because one of the challenges that I experience with measurement is clients who see it as a bolt-on cost, another way to increase the billable hours. So how do you go about convincing organizations that may be resistant, that measurement really is important? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll jump in because, again, in internal communications and in particular with writing and storytelling, when I do workshops and speak to groups of people, it's probably the most common question I get asked is how is that measured, and how do you convince your client or in the case of my clients, my boss, that we should measure this? And I'm just going to go back and leave us with a little teaser that we can come back to later, which is we all know that a good percentage of work that we are called on to do isn't necessarily going to include some measurement because the client hasn't agreed to that bolt-on cost, or because it's just not within the scope of the project for one reason or another. So my teaser question to come back to later is if it can't be measured, is it worth doing from a communications point of view? And I would enthusiastically argue yes. But to come back to your question, Shel, I think that for those of us who've sort of been around the block a little while, there are the formal measurement programs we can hope to build into a program, and in our best case scenarios have shown results, and we can use those as case studies and examples for other clients. But there are lots of situations, and I see this, I do see this in Gold Quill entries, and I think the Gold Quill, by the way, the IABC Gold Quill, the new guide that takes you through an entry, still provides a fabulous framework for setting up your measurement to begin with. And so, I go into client situations with the questions that are in that guide, or versions of them that I learned years ago, but still the essence of them is still the same. And there are ways, I think, and I defer to you, Angie, and Jim in particular, of building in those measurement tools without necessarily being formal or adding a price tag to it, if that's not possible. And I'd love to hear from you guys on that.
Well, I would say maybe 15–20% max is focused on improving communication. Most of my clients come to me and say I've got a problem, and it's I'm trying to implement lean, or I'm working with a large client right now that is trying to identify how to get its growth strategy in place better, and what's impeding that. So it's a little bit, I use the medical analogy, it's a little like they come to the doctor and they say, I'm sick, but I don't know exactly how sick I am. Can you identify what that is and fix me, make me well? And so a measurement becomes a way I do a diagnosis to identify the size of the problem. I'm also spending a deal of time, I work with financial people and others in operations to identify what the estimated costs of going after that problem is. And I have many times turned down projects because I've recommended that the return simply is going to be great enough. We did this with an Owens Corning plant where they wanted to improve certain kinds of things, but the cost of doing it was going to actually be a drain on the, wasn't sufficient. So in my case, I'm focusing mostly on somebody who's got a problem with a performance issue like safety or quality or on-time delivery or something like that.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question, Shel, because people only come to me when they know they need measurement. So because that's all I really do. I do research measurement, and I provide strategies based on it. But there's a couple things. I think measurement itself typically does have a price tag, but research does not necessarily have a price tag. And let me just give you a really simple example. When I used to work at Mercer, and I know, Shel, you worked there too, I remember there was a Chicago office consultant who was going to bid on a project for, I think it was Sears. And they said, we want a whole benefits project, we want several years of consulting help, we want this, we want that, but do not include research in your proposal. We want to do no research, no measurement. If you put it in there, you're immediately disqualified. So they didn't put measurement into the proposal, but they asked through an email to all communicators throughout the U.S., if there was a Sears store on your way home someday in the next week, stop by and ask local cashiers there a couple of key questions and email us the answers. So they quickly put together this research, which they presented as part of the proposal, although they had no budget for research in the proposal. They said, we think you might find this interesting. They got the project, and they said, now can you please come up with the budget for research? It was brilliant.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think it was the Motley Fool, which put the word out. This was years ago when iOmega was still a player in the tech field. They said, if you live in their Utah neighborhood, could you drive by at 6 in the morning or at 7 at night and tell us how full the parking lot is with employee cars? And that provided some sense of how busy they were that allowed the Motley Fool to make buy or sell recommendations.
Yeah.
Cost nothing. Letty, how about you? What do you tell your clients about the value?
Something that has surprised me a lot in Mexico is that most of the consultants do not include measurement in their proposals. And that's something that I really emphasize when I make a presentation of what the services I provide, that I really measure what the results will be after the project that I will be implementing. So I think this is something that the client has really appreciates. When I do, for example, an internal campaign and an employee communications campaign, I always propose, like, if I ask if they have made a previous diagnosis, communication diagnosis of how the communication is, and if not, I propose and I invite them to make the diagnosis. Sometimes I have done it. So because I really emphasize the importance of having a diagnosis in order to really measure how it was and how it will be after a year or six months of project that I will be implementing. And also in other situations like training, like the training program, I always include the measurement. And most of the clients that I have presented and made, with whom I made emphasis on the importance of measurement, they have accepted it, and they have already mentioned to me that most of the consultants make like big presentations and proposals, but they never mention the exact way in which they will measure the results of the implementation of the project that they are making. So I think that it really makes a difference with clients here in Mexico and in some Latin American countries with whom I have worked.
I keep hearing more and more requests for dashboards that the communicators in the organizations can use to get an at-a-glance overview of the performance of their communication efforts. But to develop a dashboard, you need baselines. So how do you develop a baseline metrics for that ongoing evaluation?
Well, it depends on what it is you're putting on the dashboard, because if you're doing a survey, you can do your own results in the past versus now, or you can also compare your survey results against database norms. But if you're looking at something like, let's say, online statistics, what I like to look at is setting a target for the future that, as an average, that is equal to the highest viewage you had in the previous year. So, for example, let's say you do 4 CEO webcasts every year, and you look at what was the highest score you had the previous year, and you say, well, you know, if we were able to get that many people, or that percentage of our employee population viewing at once, if we do a really good job, we should be able to make that our new average in the future. So depending on what you're measuring, you need to look to different places for what that baseline would be.
Other thoughts on yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I would agree with Angela there. I think a lot of the dashboards are coming out of the lean visual daily management process, because many of the communication people start with helping implement a lean process, and in doing so, they start to see how visual daily management really helps employees get involved and help problem solving. So I think it makes an awful lot of sense that communication people are doing it. I tend to like to help communication people identify what is the result that you're trying to create if you reduce the communication breakdowns that are causing people to underperform. Where are you going to focus your effort? What kind of pilots might you start in various parts of the business? And then establish those end game or the results goals that you want. And then what is the activity now that needs to take place in order for us to hit those goals? What are the steps in the process? And I think building dashboards like that makes the communication function a lot more outcome-oriented and results-based. It also helps them understand how root cause analysis can identify the right kinds of activities to address and to improve. So putting that all on a dashboard really creates your leading and trailing indicators for the communication people, and it's driving the business of the business.
Can I just explain what Jim's talking about, that leading and trailing? It's also lagging and leading measures from balanced scorecard. So
Right.
As an example, eventual understanding of something or changing a behavior would be the ultimate outcome, but by the time you measure it, it's often a past number. It happened in the past and you're just now getting the results. Like financials, when you get your quarterly financials, they're talking about what happened in the past. But there are things you can measure today that are precursors to getting those numbers that you could be measuring on a more regular basis that could go on a monthly dashboard, whereas survey results you would probably only use once a year unless you've got a huge company and you can do smaller random samples more often. I think it's a really key concept that Jim's talking about.
Yeah, I think a good example is that we know in certain environments that near misses, that is, people almost have an accident, they slipped on a stair, and for people to come in and identify how do we make that never happen again because that almost created an accident. We know that there's a relationship, inverse relationship, of more near misses we have, fewer OSHA recordables we have. So near misses becomes a leading indicator, and the reduction in OSHA recordables becomes that trailing or lagging indicator. So we start to identify what action we need to take in order to keep people from getting hurt.
We've talked a lot about surveys and some other metrics, but one of the techniques that I've become more acquainted with in the last couple of years is panels, where you have people who are repeatedly providing you with feedback or answering your questions. It's the same set of people who volunteer. There are companies that maintain panels, and you can do demographic slices and dices of those panels to get the right people, the right stakeholders giving you information. But it's the same people for a year. I've never seen these applied internally, but they're very popular with external communications. Do you see value in that particular tactic?
I think there's value. Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, no. I don't know if I want to talk over you, Angela. No, I was just going to cite an example from internal communications, Shel. A few years ago, for a large government corporation, I was called on to relaunch a print publication that had previously been taken away because the understanding, the impression was, without research, was that people wanted it all online. And then, in fact, a few years later, when readership was way down on the online version, went back and did some formal research and discovered that, in fact, people wanted ink on paper. And so I was lucky enough to come in early in the strategic development and then also the rollout of it. And we were able to set up an editorial panel that included a cross-section of employees from all over the province of British Columbia, in this case, who were signed up for 3 years. And we rotated them. We rotated some of them out, but in fact, most of them stayed for 3 years. And they were asked to, quite rudimentarily, take the print publication when they received it. They were sent a fun little kit with a red pen and a green pen, and asked to circle all the articles in green that they read first, and X the articles that they had no interest in reading, and to assign a numbering system in terms of the kinds of they had a very, very simple matrix in terms of the kind of information they took away, and it was brilliant, and it worked very, very well, and was modeled actually with was able to borrow the idea for several other clients who also had it work very well.
Yeah, Shel, I've been using the equivalent of what you described for quite a while, both informally and formally. During a fairly significant change effort, I will, what I refer to as walk the floor. I'll go out into the organization and I'll check in on certain people who I can count on, who care about the organization and who I have a lot of confidence in. I sometimes will identify somebody who I'll say, if I can get that guy on the side of the CEO, then we've made a lot of progress. And so I do a lot of the informal. I also do formal panels from time to time where in large change efforts we'll have 5 to 7 people who we bring together in those change efforts, maybe once a week, once every couple of weeks. I wouldn't personally use it for a year because I think after about 3 times they take on a life of their own and they stop representing the people that are out in the organization. So I take a little bit of care there, making sure that I'm not hearing what this group of 5 or 7 want me to hear that's inconsistent with what the floor is telling me.
That's the point that I was going to make about panels, is that they're very useful for pre-testing things, seeing how things might play with the larger audience. But if you're using it on an ongoing basis to see if things are improving, they're flawed from after the very first meeting because they know they're going to be asked certain questions the next time they see you, and they're paying much more attention to the communication than the average employee or the average customer would be. So I think there's a real role for them. But to look at them as a harbinger of change successfully happening, I think it's wrong.
I agree.
Another point that I would like to bring to our attention, and it's about the measurement. What do you think about measuring after a crisis situation, after crisis management? For example, a few years ago, I was in a pharmaceutical company, and the most important product was withdrawn from the market worldwide, and this was announced just the same day to everybody. So it depended on the different countries on how we used to handle this in front of the media and with the different stakeholders, with government, with the physicians, with the customers, with everybody. And after some time, the CEO congratulated us in Mexico because the way in which this has been handled, because this has not been a negative scandal in the news. And the Secretary of Health congratulated us of how this was managed. However, in other countries, this was really on all the headlines in a negative way. So how do you handle, how do you measure the impact of this, how this was handled in different places? When this is crisis, this is a crisis management. We were not aware that this was going to happen, and definitely it affects the reputation of the company. It affects the perception of the different external stakeholders.
I think it affects more than reputation. It's going to affect possible sales of the other products you're selling. Because if you've lost the confidence of physicians, they're going to switch the prescriptions of their patients to your competitors where it's similar. So I would look at what happened to the sales of your other products in those countries. I would look at the extremes where the media was really, really horrible, and then unlike on your end where it was handled really, really well. And I bet you'd see a difference in loss of prescriptions for some of those other products where the crisis was not handled well. I know Bank of America saw that. When they had crises going on in their investment banking arm, they lost new sales for the retail banking where you and I might open an account. And a friend of mine was able to use that number of how much they lost to get the CEO to say, yes, I guess we should talk to the media the next time a big scandal erupted, because they didn't realize how much they lost just because of that.
Yeah, I also think that there's value in for larger organizations who have the budget to be part of the Reputation Institute and to be able to take advantage of the scores there. But I think my favorite metric that was employed in crisis situations was a study that was done out of Oxford, and I think this has got to be 13, 14 years old now. But what they did was they looked at public companies in crisis and divided them into two groups. One group was those that basically listened to their lawyers and said no comment or deflected or shifted blame or what have you. The others were ones that took responsibility and apologized and offered up some idea of what they were going to do to keep this from happening in the future. And they looked at the share price the day before the crisis, at the end of the close the day of the crisis, and at the end of the fiscal year. And what they found was that the organizations that did the right thing, that took accountability, if you know, it was their fault, they accepted that and talked about remediation efforts, their share prices not only recovered but ended the fiscal year higher than the day before the crisis, whereas those that listened to their lawyers and issued the no comments ended up with share prices at the end of the year significantly lower than the share price was the day before. And you know, there were some other metrics associated with that. But you know, that's a pretty compelling number to say, look, your share price is going to fall. The value of your organization will decline if you don't do the right thing. So I would certainly track share price if you're a public organization after a crisis.
Sure, absolutely.
I want to, we only have 6 minutes left, and I want to get back to Jennifer's teaser question because I think it's a great question to end with. Jennifer, if I remember correctly, you were asking if it's not measurable, is it worth doing? Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, sort of the if a tree falls in the forest question. I guess, again, in internal communications and storytelling and writing, I work on a lot of projects that don't get measured formally. And what I'd like to think I bring to the table when I'm asked to, or given the opportunity to, not even necessarily asked to, is in many cases a long-term working history with a client that allows me to inject some research thinking when there is the opportunity to do that. So an example might be a publication I work on for a major university, and over the years, historically, I've worked on it for many, many years, we've had sort of waxing and waning appetites for readership surveys. And so, you know, about once a year, I bring it up in my revised strategy for the client, and I'm declined, and I'm a consultant. I'm not going to turn down the work, and frankly, it's good communication. It's good work. However, about every 2 years, they do a donor survey, and I've been able to figure out ways to get some questions into the donor relations aspect of it, which of course comes back to the ROI, or you know, a much more numbers-oriented way of measuring it, that have in fact given us indirect research that shows that the publication is hitting the mark. So to answer my own question, is it worth doing? Yes, it is. Sometimes, you know, sometimes we have to trust our gut instincts and know that the work is good work. Sometimes it just pays the bills, and I'm not talking not just from a communications consulting perspective. I saw a former client yesterday who's just in a completely reactive manufacturing atmosphere right now, and all she can do is churn out what the CEO wants, and it's just that kind of a phase right now. And she knows, she's been in the business long enough, that phase will end, probably, because either she will go or he will go. But you know, it's not that she's not doing good work and worthwhile work. And so I think we can get, I think we always need to be aspiring to that state of measurement that people like you, Angie, Shel, and Jim represent for us. But I think that the reality, the everyday reality for many, many people is that measurement is not necessarily part of the package from a formal point of view.
Jim? Interested in
I completely agree with you. I mean, there are going to be times when we're working with clients who aren't interested in it, or they just do it, just get it over with. We want to do this, and we don't want to measure it. I've had a couple of those in the last couple of years working with the pharma I mentioned earlier. They're not big projects, but they are projects that, frankly, I needed to say to the head of medical affairs, now you understand that this may not be generating the kind of return that would be acceptable in most businesses. And sometimes she would say, I understand, we just have to do it. In which case, I've cleared my conscience, and she's comfortable with it, and we go and we do the kinds of things that will satisfy her needs. But there are going to be times of that. I try to minimize that, because I try to focus a lot on the returns that I'm trying to help the client create.
I think one of the things that Jennifer just mentioned is there was also a different survey going on for donors. This is something that we can always piggyback on, even if there's not a budget for research on the particular communication we're working on. If you already have an engagement survey, or you have a customer survey, or you have a reputation survey, we could potentially ask a couple of questions that are like access to certain communication channels. Either do you have access, or how often do you use, or how often do you follow the CEO's blog, or how often do you read the publication? Because then what you can do is you can use that as a demographic filter for how people answered all of the other questions. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but if you can show that the people who come to the town hall meetings are much more committed to staying at the company or understand the strategy better, it's starting to show that this is a correlation between a particular communication and one of those outcomes that are already on those existing surveys that are already paid for.
Okay. Letty, let's wrap up with you.
Yes, well, I believe that most of the projects that we do on communication are measurable, definitely, but definitely also there are some that will not, we will not have the budget to measure. But as Angie mentioned, there are always different ways that even if you don't have the the perception, the impact that it has. No, so as a consumer, I always ask that we should do measurement. Some clients do not want to do it, but I think that's a difference that we can make. It's like our responsibility, and as a professional, we should emphasize the importance of measuring in order for them also to see the difference between what was being made before and the results that we had with the project that we implemented. So definitely measurement is quite important in this side.
Excellent. And our hour is up with that. It went by really fast, and I have a list of questions we didn't even get to. So it's been terrific. Thank you, everybody. The Circle of Fellows will be back in September with another collection of IABC Fellows and another topic for a deep dive. But I do want to express my gratitude to the four of you for taking part in the second episode of this show.
Thank you, Shel.
Thanks, Shel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.